All right, so since this is my thesis defense, I've been getting a lot of advice on how to proceed. And one of the pieces of advice I got this morning was that the best defense is a strong offense. So try to be very offensive. So with that, I would like to move forward into the work that I've been working on for the last couple of years. Today I'm going to talk to you about dynamic procedure aids, a method for supporting emergency response. So we looked at the domain of medicine. Medicine is compelling because it has massive scale. There were 33.6 million admissions to US hospitals over the course of 1 year, and 234 million worldwide surgeries over the course of 1 year. In addition, it has huge impact, helping people lead longer, healthier lives. Now, why crisis response in emergency medicine? Well, there we go. From human factors literature, we know that people perform the worst during highly stressful situations. And when they're bored or when they're overstressed. And doctors who deal with emergency medicine are the first to tell you that their work is hours of boredom followed by moments of sheer terror. Second, this is a good example of, why does that not want to, the clicker, there we go. Clicker like skipping. Okay, so this is a good example of a philosophy in HCI of designing for extreme users or lead users. If we can figure out how to do things right in the middle of a cardiac arrest response, many of those ideas should transfer over to the routine activities of day-to-day medicine. So how do we improve emergency medical response? We argue it is by reducing errors. So there's a very influential medical study called the Harvard study, which estimated that in the US, there were between 44,000 and 98,000 preventable deaths per year. So these are deaths where some kind of human error was involved. And here, error is defined as the failure of a planned action to be completed as intended, or the use of a wrong plan to achieve an aim. It's important to mention here that medical errors don't happen because doctors are incompetent or unskilled. Doctors do between 30,000 and 60,000 hours of training, depending on their specialty. Rather, medicine as it exists now is too complicated for any one person to always get it right. These procedures are at the edge of tractable complexity. Errors are easy to make, yet the perilous environment is severely unforgiving to even small errors. Some experts, like Deming, believe that the only way to reduce errors in this kind of environment is by improving process. So today I'm primarily going to talk to you about error mitigation in emergency medicine with a specific focus on cardiac arrest. Although we believe these ideas will extend to other domains. So let's dive into creating dynamic procedure aids. Over the course of 16 months, we spent more than 50 hours observing realistic, simulated operating room crisis response at Stanford with our collaborators. Crisis simulation was pioneered at Stanford by Dr. David Gaba, who, inspired by his experience as an amateur airplane pilot. The goal of these simulations is to teach and evaluate crisis response. These simulations are engineered to be highly realistic, using a very sophisticated robot mannequin patient, real OR staff and equipment, and Broadway theater levels of production. Let's watch a part of a crisis simulation. So anesthesiologist, the woman on the left, may split visual attention between a vitals display, the patient, preparing a drug vial, and simultaneously ensuring that other staff continue high-quality CPR during a crisis. In this example, we see that the anesthesiologist on the left has just started to notice that there's an error happening, and they're about to communicate this error to the surgeons.
Speaking of fast, he's getting tachycardic now. What are you up to?
So this is an example of, these are two good examples in this video. One of them is vigilance. The anesthesiologist is paying attention and notices when the heart rate starts to change. The second is that there's good teamwork here. there's an immediate communication of the problem to the surgeon even before it becomes a crisis. Now, there's going to be a lot of good examples in this video because this video is actually designed as an example of good practical skills for anesthesiologists in crisis response. So a couple minutes later, another anesthesiologist in the front has joined and is there to start helping.
We're on oxygen. We're on 100% oxygen volatile.
I want you to watch.
Can you grab the cards?
As this crash cart comes in, the second anesthesiologist grabs some paper cognitive aids from this cart.
Sandy, I want you to be in charge. Kyle, you're in charge of the CPR quality.
Okay, you're doing 100 times a minute, Sandy? Let me
Staying
know
alive.
when you get tired. You're
Rich,
gonna
can
take
you
over
get
when
my
you get
random
tired?
stuff for a second IV, please?
Yeah, I'll get it.
And the pressure bag,
As the crisis
please.
Is there a
proceeds,
backboard
they
in the
start
PCU?
walking
It's on
through
the back
each
of
of
the
the
code
items
card.
that's on this checklist. Now there's something important here that's happened just at the end.
Okay, let's lock that table.
When he had to go and get the backboard, he put down the paper cognitive aids. Let's see that one more time.
In the patient yet?
It's on the back of the code card.
Okay, we can get the backboard on.
Right there. This is actually a very common occurrence when using cognitive aids or checklist in the operating room because you need your hands to do things. However, it's actually very common that the checklist will never be picked back up again. Somebody gets distracted and they never get back around to it. In this video, you will see them pick it back up again because, again, it's an example of good practice. Another thing to notice is where it gets put. It gets put on the top of a crash cart. This is a common place to put all kinds of things, such as clipboards where people are taking notes, or when the defibrillator gets shifted around. So often things will actually end up on top of the checklist. So 2 more minutes in, we suddenly have a whole bunch of new faces. There's still 2 people doing CPR. Now we have 1 person setting an IV. We have 1 person prepping an IV bag. 1 person who's about to start come on the screen and start setting the defibrillator paddles. The lead for the crisis and the support anesthesiologist for the crisis. Many codes also have a dedicated pharmacist for prepping drugs, 1 to 2 people to ventilate or give air, and potentially even several other surgeons, interns, or nurses in the room. So this is actually a relatively small code situation.
Sats were at 97, they dropped quickly. I'm going to listen to the long sound. Pads on, please, thank you.
So in this clip, I want you to keep track of the technology being used, as there's a lot already in this environment. The lead anesthesiologist is now using a stethoscope, dealing with the ventilator machine. The vitals display for the patient is up and to the right off the screen. Down below the screen, now to the left, you see a defibrillator, and to the right, they've just wheeled in a big machine, which is a heart echo.
Hyper or hypokalemia, hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia. You can check all those.
If we're going to add something to this environment, we want to make sure that we're not going to be overloading the team
Pads are on, please get a blood glass.
any more than they already are.
When you do the TB,
I'll be right with you.
it's in the second drawer, I believe.
Hypothermia or hyperthermia, any risk for any
Temperature is 36.4, no family history we knew of. I would say low risk.
So there's one more thing that I want to point out about this video. Even though it's an example of good practice, we actually have an error slip by unnoticed. If you see here, there's a little inflatable green bag which is on the ventilation machine. This bag being inflated means that the ventilation machine is not currently circulating air into the patient. And this can actually cause some of the issues that they're actually seeing, some of the symptoms that they're seeing. So how did this happen? Let's take another quick look. And this time, keep your eye on that bag.
Can you
go to manual, flip that switch for me?
Here, she's switched to manual from
Yes,
automatic, which inflates the bag and allows her to control the amount of oxygen that gets put in.
Okay. Resume CPR. I hear clear, distant lung sounds bilaterally.
Okay.
And now they've moved on without reflecting on the fact that that was actually never switched back to automatic. So everything in this video says practical skills matter. The things that they don't teach you in medical school are also really important, such as teamwork, vigilance, and situational awareness. So prior work has looked at what are these practical skills, or also called non-technical skills, that are important in this environment. One of them is task management. Examples of this are planning and preparing, identifying and utilizing resources. The second one is teamworking. Here we might be doing exchanging of information, using authority and assertiveness, or supporting others. Third identified is situational awareness. So this might be gathering information, recognizing and understanding, or anticipating problems. And finally, decision making. So here we have identifying options, balancing risks and selecting options, and reevaluating the situation as it progresses. So some examples of good teamwork which we saw in this video are confirmation of responsibilities. You make sure that everybody knows what their role is, and discussing the case with your colleagues. You make sure that as soon as an error is, or as soon as an issue arises, you're letting the other people in the room know so they can make appropriate decisions. Some examples of poor situational awareness, which we didn't really see in this video, are no confirmation, meaning that somebody asked you to do something and you don't acknowledge it, or you're distracted from your monitoring, so something comes up and you're not looking at the patient when an important vitals change happens. So throughout this observation and our later participatory design, we were trying to answer the question, can we design an aid that will be better at reducing errors than those existing paper aids that they're using? Well, in order to know that, we'll actually have to understand a little bit better what are those existing aids that they're using. Doctors have begun to adopt risk management techniques from aviation, such as training and simulation, crew resource management, and the use of checklists. Checklists are hailed as a vessel of safety culture, and that the overarching purpose of checklists is that the standardization of commonly accepted, efficacious practice. Harrison et al. Found that anesthesia care teams improve their performance the more that they use such aids as checklists. So the benefits of checklists generalize to procedurally organized knowledge, which are oftenly called cognitive aids. Here's the cognitive aid book designed by our collaborators here at Stanford. And in one of the studies examined in Atul Gawande's book on checklists, in hospitals of different types and countries, introducing checklists saw major complications from surgery drop 36% and deaths 47%. The performance of checklists does not always live up to the promise, however. Good old animations. Looking into the literature, we get some sense for why this might be. Some studies have shown great success in cognitive aids, some other studies have actually shown no results, so there's some mixed results on whether or not cognitive aids are really helping. Cognitively, checklists can sometimes interrupt workflow. For example, finding and searching checklists can induce additional time, attentional demand, and complexity. Researchers found that the time governs willingness and compliance of use in checklists. So how long does it take to use them? However, in psychological terms, it actually be that the perceived time of use may be a more salient variable here. This procedural interference and cultural skepticism has slowed checklist adoption by medical teams. Although checklists are increasingly being used, only a few have explored the personnel experience, and those that have find barriers such as the checklist slowing down or otherwise disrupting the procedure. In order for checklists to make a positive benefit, there must be buy-in from head physicians and support from administration. And though current checklists often provide benefits, their costs have impeded changes in medical practice. This leads us to believe that a stronger benefit to cost ratio could help tip the scales. So, through our observation and participatory design work with our collaborators, we found 4 needs and illustrate these needs through a style that was actually inspired by our final design. The first was ready access. The aids need to be available immediately, and they need to be not hidden and not covered up. Rapid assimilation. The aids need to be used very quickly, on the order of seconds. Professional acceptance. So here we need some buy-in from the people in the room. They need to want to use it, and they need to have practiced with it. And limited attention. Everyone in the room has limited attention, and designing for that is going to be key. Let's move to the first item. So in the video you saw, when the doctor put down the cognitive aid onto the crash cart, there actually was the opportunity for things to get put on it. And as we've seen in many simulations, things do get put on top of the cognitive aids and they never get picked back up again. So one of the key concepts for aid design is we want to make them visible to the team. And we decided to do that through large screen displays. Here we have an example of a large screen display on the wall on the left in front of the anesthesiologist. And behind the anesthesiologist, we have another large screen display on the crash cart that gets rolled in, along with a tablet. And all of these have mirrored content. If you like a top-down view, here's another way of looking at it. And there are the displays. So our design instantiation here was making a display and interaction across multiple large screens and tablets. And this helps address the problem by providing a shared context, facilitates finding the checklist, and helps them provide more detail upon request. So let's look at rapid assimilation. Here, the key concepts are that we need to be able to do each task with the aid in one multitasking cycle, however long that takes. You need to focus on what the people are doing now in the room by using the context and where they are in the procedure. We want to really simplify the display to make it quick to read. And we want to help by actually designing a new, shorter syntax that will help people with speed reading and search. So prior research has done a great job of externalizing best practices and getting them into the OR. But we think these aids have ignored effective visual design, and because they are static, they can't take advantage of some of the concepts that we think are important for rapid assimilation. So in our design, we actually only show the information from the aid that's relevant to the current context. And in some sense, we're cheating here by putting things on a computer and making less content visible. But that's kind of the point. We want to take advantage of the dynamic properties of computers. So here, the design instantiation was the progressive aid protocol. So how do we show certain parts of the aid relevant to the context that they're in? And there's one more thing that I talked about, which is a concise language for expressing things. So we developed a way of condensing the verbiage that's used in the cognitive aids that we call object action. So here's an example of two list items from the existing paper cognitive aids. And this is what they might look like after you've put them into object action form. So here what we've done is we've brought out the main term out front, highlighted that for quick scanning, and we've put the extra details a little bit subdued off to the right of that. We also try to remove as many of the words as possible. So we don't need words like with or if. And we try to really condense that language down. So here, the design instantiation was, again, the progressive aided protocols and the object action compressible language. This helps address the problem by helping things be faster to read, skim, and search due to fewer words, a stereotyped syntax, and better information mapping. We're trying to help here make things processable in small units of time for multitasking. So let's move on to professional acceptance. So one of the things that we found was that people who, if you weren't going to use the aid during non-crisis, there's no way you were going to remember to use the aid during crisis. So in particular, we wanted to reframe our checklist as part of a larger resource management system. Each time a team member would like to gather resource information, they could look up at the same screen, whether it's crisis or not. And resource information here could be things like who are the people in the room or who's scheduled to be in the room, what is the short list of the patient's medical history, or what drugs do you have in the room, and what kind of blood is available outside of the room. We hope to lower the activation energy for acquiring information by getting people in the habit of looking up at the screen and facilitate serendipitous reminding and create the habit of more frequent consulting of these resources. Our design work also uncovered desires for many additional interesting features in this space, including timelines or event records of activity, embedding patient vitals within our display, and even keeping track of each member of the crisis team is working on. In the end, however, it turned out that simplicity and speed far outweighed the potential benefits of these features for our stakeholders, and so they were removed. So, again, we wanted to reframe the checklist as part of a larger resource management system. And here, our design instantiation was rapid access to team names, supplies, calculators, references, and allow the aid to transition from routine to crisis mode upon demand. This helps address the problem by providing incentive to use the system, familiarizing and habituating the practitioners to use it. Finally, let's move on to the limited attention. Attention is a limiting factor. In fact, it might be the major limiting factor, according to some related work. So here we have a graph that shows performance over how much workload you have. So on the right side, you have very high workload or high stress. Performance tends to degrade. But it's also the case that under very low workload or boredom, performance will also degrade. So the key concept here is that we want the direct interface focused dynamically. So what do we mean? Well, here's a design instantiation, one design instantiation, automated drug timers and attentional prompts. So one thing that we can do is we can say, if you're going to redose epinephrine in 5 minutes, you shouldn't have to write that down or remember it. We can keep track of that for you and let you know how long is left so that when you have that serendipitous look up when you're habituated to look up at the screen regularly, you can keep track of things easily. So this addresses the problem by having the cognitive aid serve as an attentional aid as well. So this is what our final design looked like after the participatory design and observation. One of the principles that we like to use is focus plus context. So what we try to do here is we try to focus on the main item now, atropine, and give a little bit of context of what's happened before and what's about to happen after in the procedure. So that wraps up the first inventing. Let's move on to evaluating. So some of the key questions we had in evaluating these dynamic aids were, do dynamic procedure aids support crisis response? And do dynamic procedure aids outperform paper aids in this support? To investigate this hypothesis embedded in this system, we developed the narrative simulation approach, which makes use of pre-timed scenario and interface slides. Narrative simulation, inspired by the megacode video training materials, presents scenarios in a linear fashion no matter how the participant responds. The participant sees a slide-based presentation which automatically advances to tell the patient's story. So who were our participants? Well, we had 9 medical students and 29 MDs come through and run our narrative simulations. And here, the key to narrative simulation is that people respond differently. They do different things at different time. And these differences compound over the course of a real situation. So how do we get the compare across people? In the narrative, one of the ways that we do that is by putting the scenario on rails. So in this way, no matter what the participant answers to any particular question, they're set back on the right path, the path of the scenario, whether that's right or not. And then they're asked another question, assuming that they had followed the path of the scenario. In this way, we get about 30 roughly independent measures across each narrative simulation as the participants answer 30 questions. We think this will actually be a useful way to study expert performance in many domains, not just in medicine. So this was our setup. Now let's quickly look at a video and see what it looked like from. So one thing to notice is on the right we have a distractor task. Every time a colored circle appears, they have to respond to that quickly. On the far left we have the scenario being presented on one screen with text. And in the middle, which you can't see in this shot, but we'll see in the next, we have our aid on a second screen. And you'll notice that it was every couple, 5 to 10 seconds that they have to respond to this distractor task.
Yeah, it's got some GDCs. Does he have a pulse? Is the most important thing. So.
We asked our participants to answer questions out loud. In this way, we could get a feel for what they were imagining what should happen next.
Okay, weak thermal pulse. Unresponsive. Okay. Start fluid bolus. Start him on an epinephrine drip.
So what do the scenarios actually look like? I'll walk you through a quick slides here, but I won't belabor it too much. We give some background information. We give some setup. And then we give some of the information that's actually on the vitals displays and on the machines in the room. Finally, we ask a question and give the participant 10 seconds to respond to that question. So we had two measures here. We had one measure which was their score in answering the questions. And we had a second measure which was their own perceived score in answering these questions. We asked them, like, how many questions do you feel like you missed? And how much do you think that the different aids you used helped you on this task? So here's our baseline. This is performance with no aid. With paper aids, we saw a small difference, but it wasn't statistically significant. However, with dynamic aids, we saw a large improvement. In addition, doctors actually self-assessed about the same scale as the real results showed. So if we look here, about 5% on paper and about 15% on dynamic, we can actually overlay that on top of this graph to get a feel for what the doctors thought they would have performed at from our baseline. So it's in the ballpark. So this is evidence that the principles that we've been using to design these aids, of making things easier to find and reducing friction in using the aids, are actually paying off. We've given them a large screen display that's easy to look at. We've made it fast to use and relevant to the context they're in. And we've given them timers to help remember when things are coming up. Something else worth noting is that when you break in between med students and the full medical doctors, there's an interesting difference in how much the aids actually helped. So the doctors, it made about an 8-point difference in their score on average. But the medical students actually made about a 20-point difference on average. Now, there's a story that gets told that you don't want to go to the hospital in July because that's when all the new residents come in. That's when all the people who are just med students arrive. And if that story is really true, these kinds of cognitive aids may be one way of mitigating that problem. It's also interesting to note that our results for paper are different from what previous research has shown. We believe that minimal training and the artificially constrained question answering intervals may contribute to this difference. So narrative simulation is a great method for quickly testing hypotheses. With John Basson, we ran a 10-person within subjects test looking at if providing a mobile aid en route to the crisis would help. So here, the participants were given an aid. They were asked to run to where the simulation was taking place, and then they stood in front of a screen set up very much like last time. And we had a really surprising finding that early diagnosis was actually worse for those people who had en route condition, possibly due to a mismatch between how much people thought they had remembered and what they actually remembered from using the aid while on the move. Narrative simulation was key to letting us quickly get some insight onto this issue. From a medical perspective, a narrative simulation isn't well understood yet. One line of future work is to look at how performance in a narrative simulation links to patient outcome measures, similar to what has been done for those high-fidelity simulations where we did our observation. This would help us understand how the skills being evaluated in a narrative simulation relate to the skills that doctors use during real crisis response, allowing us to further improve narrative simulations and be able to predict how results obtained in narrative simulations would impact real performance. Another interesting use for the narrative simulations could be as part of a larger ecosystem, where it's a very inexpensive tool that doctors could use frequently, where they can only get into these high-fidelity simulations occasionally. So let's take a little bit closer look on how important speed is. We've asked ourselves these questions. How long does it take to find an answer on the different cognitive aid designs? And what major design principles can lead to faster search times? Well, we know from the related work that latency changes behavior. If you're driving in a car and you have to use your radio or GPS, or, God forbid, you're trying to send a text message on your cell phone, you would take your eyes off the road when you glance down to use this device. If your task is fast, you look up before you have drifted very far and correct your steering to stay in the lane. However, driving performance degrades as glance time increases. What kind of glance times matter for driving? Well, one study showed that about 12% of glance times are above 1.6 seconds. And glance times above 1.6 seconds account for 86% of observed collisions. But even very small latency on routine tasks can significantly impact behavior. Brutlag found that adding between 100 and 400 milliseconds latency to the Google search page actually reduced the daily number of searches, and that this effect persisted proportional to the time that the user was exposed to the added latency. So small timing differences can make qualitative changes in how people behave. So glance times in the OR. People have looked a little bit at glance times in the OR, and it turns out that on average, people are looking at the monitors for, these are flipped, sorry, 3.7 seconds, and at the patient for, on average, 7.2 seconds at a glance. In addition, they do, in non-crisis, they'll do about 5 looks per minute at the patient, and they'll do about 4 looks per minute at the monitors. And for those monitors, about 75% of the looks that they do are actually 3 seconds or less. So these are very short, not quite as short as driving, but very short glance times. So let's look at the aids that we want to test. We did a within-subject study where every participant saw each of the 5 different aid styles and 15 questions on each of those aids. This is what current best practice is. This is a set of aids where they've grouped the steps into logical blocks that help constrain the visual search that were designed by our collaborators at Stanford. This is what we call an enhanced Gawande version, designing by our team to try to improve on Gawande's aid in a static format. Step blocks are used along with the object action language we talked about, and information patches where visually separable regions like the drugs or the visual alignment of words help people find things quickly. Fourth, we had a pictographic aid. In this aid, for each item, they try to create a memorable visual anchor to help people find and come back to those items quickly. And finally, we tested our dynamic aid. Okay, to show you what kind of tasks were being performed, it will require just a little bit of our audience participation. So, raise your hand if you've attended CPR training. That's pretty good, actually, more than 50%. Nice. Okay, so I want everybody to look at the picture that the aid that I show you, and raise your hand when you've found out what the dosage is for the drug vasopressin. Ready? Go. All right, we've got about half of you in about 10 seconds, which is surprisingly similar to the results that we saw. Now let's do that once more, but this time with a different aid design. Again, look for the drug vasopressin and the dosage. Ready? Go. Awesome. It's like sub 2 seconds. It's even better than I expected. All right, so what kind of data are we collecting when we do these studies? Well, what you guys were doing was looking across the aid, frantically, trying to find vasopressin. You may have started on the left where it said epinephrine or vasopressin, and then realized that that wasn't where the drug dosage was, and then looked off to the right of the screen where it said that the drug dosage was 40 units, or in this case, 32. So what did we find? We found the guanide aids on a median time of about 8 seconds. Now, it's worth noting here that this is the log plot, and there actually is a log normal distribution here. So the averages are further out due to high outliers. We also found that the pictographic and the enhanced guanide were on approximately the same level overall. The block aid was marginally better, but not quite statistically significant. And the dynamic aids were significantly faster to answer questions overall than any of the other aids, as you witnessed. However, there's more to the story. If we break up performance by the 15 different questions that we ask, aids did not perform equally. They performed well on some, but poorly on others. In statistical terms, there was a strong interaction effect between aid style and the question being asked. So here we have an example where the block aid in blue has performed very poorly. It has almost a 20-second average time. However, over here on the right, we see the blue is done quite well, the block aid is done quite well, and it's the guanide aid which is done quite poorly. So let's take a closer look first and see what's happening here. So this question was, what is the appropriate ventilation rate, or how many breaths should you give per minute during CPR? In the color block, which did poorly, we see that a lot of people spent time looking at the red box here. Now that box is where the CPR information is contained. But one of the reasons why this way did poorly on this task was that the answer, the ventilation rate, is at the top of this second box down here, where you can see people have started to look. So people spent a lot of time looking where they thought the information should be before they actually moved on to where the information was. Here, in the enhanced guanide, we see the CPR section and one spot right here where the information is. So the information was actually located where people expected it to be, and all the CPR information was located together. So let's take a look at that second question. In this question that we asked, how many joules, or how high should the shock be when you're defibrillating a patient? So what we see here is they spend a lot of time on the right-hand section, which is labeled defibrillator, but there's no information there about how high the shock should be. Then we see the person look up and down the left-hand column. This is because the left-hand column is a sequence of repeated steps where in only 1 or 2 places will you actually find the shock setting, which in this case says shock at a medium setting. Medium setting isn't a technical term. That was changed for the study as a note. So this is what the heat map would look like for that eye trace. People looked a lot here where the defibrillator was. They checked out what these boxes were. And then they spent a lot of time looking up and down this column trying to find the joules to shock at. Now, if we look at the parallel heat map for the dynamic aid, we see that people found defibrillate, and then they found the joules. The search was very focused. There wasn't a lot of looking around. The color block did pretty well. It was actually the second best at this task. They have their defibrillate right here, located at the top. Now their strategy in general of limiting visual search was relatively successful overall. The pictographic here shows, again, one highlight here where the answer is, and one iconic picture. But the results weren't too bad. They were in the middle. In this case, the image gave the people something to anchor on quickly, and then they found the defibrillate right after that. But there is some amount, whoops, lost that. It is important to point out that there's some amount of looking at every single one of these boxes, which means that some participant looked everywhere on that aid. Finally, we show a failed case of an attempt to translate some elements of our dynamic style into the static paper form. The problem here is that we followed the Gowanda aid too closely, poorly representing that repeated cycle in replicated blocks. This led to multiple similar targets and longer doctor search for this case. This example is given to illustrate a point. While we develop a number of design concepts that can be used to generate aids, we also employ our method to evaluate the detailed use of an aid and identify what went wrong. We really think that generating these aids is an important part of what our work can contribute. If you look at the previous work on Gowande's aid, this is their methods section for how they went about designing their aids. They got a multidisciplinary expert panel together in a room. They all sat down and talked for a long time and formally review the content and design of the checklists. So this doesn't give us a lot of help if we want to do our own checklists, although they are clearly experts and do a good job. So at a high level, we have these 5 guidelines that are instantiated across all of these aids. These are not just visual techniques. They reach into the content to help better express medical ideas. We are linking types of content and types of visual expression. So here, the compressed object action language that I was talking to you about, information patches, which is instantiated in some of our designs as columns and separate boxes for the drugs. Step blocks, so the block aid, you can put similar content into a box to link it together. Pictograms, so using some kind of iconic representation that's helping people search and remember where information is. And focus plus context. So we want to use the context of the crisis in order to show just what's important at the current time. So we've used eye tracking to evaluate our design, and we're certainly not the first to do this. Eye tracking has been used to evaluate web page design for a while. Some of the findings that they have is that on web pages, the top left is much more salient, and the scattering dependents can be task dependent or not task dependent, depending on how the researchers measure. And some work from psychology has also looked at web page design and eye tracking, trying to figure out, can top-down search overcome bottom-up visual processing? So another way to say this is, if you're looking for something, will you do a different search pattern than if you're just looking around the page and having whatever's visually salient draw your attention? In this case, they did support that top-down can overcome bottom-up for their search task. And finally, some people have shown that new web page designs people will adapt to quickly. So if you take the navigation bar from a web page and you put it in a new location, as long as you're consistent for that web page, people will very quickly adapt and use it just like they would use any other web page. So through all of this eye tracking and principles, we revised our dynamic aid to integrate some of those things that we learned from the eye tracker. Here we see a stronger object action format and columns that help create information patches for people to look when they want to find the topic on the left and then know exactly on the right where the column is. Again, here's an example of consistent drug representation. You always give the name, the dosage, and extra text, always in the same format so that people can quickly read it and understand it. So everything that we've talked about so far is related to using aids for health professionals in medicine. There's also an opportunity to make personal aids that help individuals make better decisions about their health day to day. In another project that I worked on here at Stanford, we tried to develop some personal health aids. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, stroke, and type 2 diabetes have all been demonstrably linked to a small number of key health behaviors, including regular physical activity and the reduction of prolonged daily sitting time. Now, regular physical activity means about 20 minutes per day of brisk walking. The goal of this project, codenamed MILES, was to use mobile phones to promote physical activity and reduce sedentary time. We designed 3 different interventions, each as a mobile app, using different theories derived from behavioral science literature. The first was an analytic framing. So this motivational frame was giving people numbers, asking them to do goal setting, and having them be very involved in tracking their own activity. The second motivational frame was social. So here we had people compare themselves to others, both as team members, collaboration, and as other teams, competition. Here the goal wasn't to walk the most yourself, but the goal was to have your team walk more than the other team. Third, we have an affect or emotional design. Here the goal was to make your little avatar, a flying bird, happier and fly higher. So you didn't get any numbers about how much more you were walking, but you did get this little bird that would give you some feedback. If you like the bird, then maybe that helped. So the results from an 8-week behavioral adoption period indicated that all 3 applications were sufficiently robust to significantly improve regular, moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity and decrease leisure time sitting. So let's do a quick recap. We talked about inventing dynamic procedure aids. We talked about evaluating them with narrative simulation. We talked about deeper investigations using eye tracking to look at layout and visual design. And finally, we talked a little bit about how aids can come and become personal patient health aids to help you make better health decisions. And really, the main takeaway of all of this work is that dynamic procedure aids do better than paper aids by utilizing context and design principles. There are a couple of really interesting directions that we can go from here. We can start to build an ecosystem of devices that can include personal displays like Google Glass. We can also come full circle and study dynamic procedure aids in the high-fidelity simulators where we did our initial observations. Or we can bring dynamic procedure aids to new domains. Anything from cooking directions to writing research papers to programming might benefit from aids that can present standardized procedures based on utilizing context. So I just want to give some quick thank yous for all of this. My contributors, Leslie Wu, Kristen, John, Kyle, Larry, Stu, and Scott. I couldn't have done any of this work without your help. And my advisor, Scott, who has worked patiently with me for these last 5 years and has always been willing to go the extra mile to help me out. My committee members, and everyone else that's helped make this project a success. Finally, my friends and family. I couldn't have done it without all of your support. My mom, who's here in spirit. Pop, you've been an amazing role model all of my life, and I've learned to follow my passions in work and my hobbies through you. I wouldn't be here without you. Jason, I am constantly thankful that I have you as a friend and as a brother. And Maria, you help me stay balanced and sane every day. I'm a better and happier person because of you. And with that, I'll take questions. Yeah.
So Jesse, so how much manual effort is it to transcribe one of these, like the Gowande thing, into your system, or is there some semi-automated ways to do that?
So it took a year to translate the Gowande aid into our system the first time around. In the future, what we're hoping is actually to build a tool that will help people who are not designers to do this. So you can imagine something like an Excel spreadsheet with the different titles and levels of detail that can be automatically translated rule-based into something that looks like the dynamic aid. Yeah, Wendy?
It struck me when you were talking about how they did the Gowande aids initially, and you have experts who have lots of experience and they design something. And then you have the dynamic aids, and then and you're able to do these evaluations. That's focusing on sort of the object action thing and so on. What happens if you look at where the primary errors occur? So if you could actually watch what people are really doing in real medical emergencies, and if you found out that there's a few things that they always do that are real problems, and then less and less and less and less. So would that change the way you would do the dynamic aids? Because obviously you're not going to be able to deal with that with the static ones, but with the dynamic aids you could. So how would you take that into account?
Yeah, so one of the things we actually did in our original designs was look at the 5 H's and T's. So these are the underlying causes for cardiac arrest. And one of the things that they started off as H's and T's because they're as a memory tool. You know there's 5 H's, you know there's 5 T's, and it's a way for doctors to help remember if they've gone through everything and thought about all the causes. But what we realized was that some causes are more likely than other causes are. And we actually reordered that list so that when you get the cognitive aid that comes up and says, hey, have you considered this cause? It's the most common cause first. And then you work through that list in order. Yeah, Michael?
Actually, bouncing off that question, your main takeaway was that dynamic aids were the big winner.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, what is it about the dynamic nature of it that is making it the winner? Is it something inherent about the interactivity of the systems you're building in comparison to something that you could flatten onto a static image or printout? Like the reasons you gave in the design principles you were talking about largely seem like they could apply to a static case easily as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me pull up that one of the graphs that I showed. And I just got to find it.
Yeah, as a baseline, you could sort of unroll your dynamic aid into a big long list.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. So I think that I would point to this graph to kind of answer that question. So one of the things that we're able to do is just put less text on the screen, which means it's easier to learn. So I would compare that to increasing skill. So it's easier to become highly skilled with a dynamic aid. And since we're looking at tasks that have a very short time window, if you can become highly skilled and you can perform better without any training, for example, in our study aids, then that might give a big win over paper aids, which would take a lot more training. So you can imagine, let's say you trained on those paper aids for an hour. You might be able to push that curve up more like the dynamic aid, where you're performing higher and faster because you're familiar with the aids. And so I would kind of suggest that the paper aids are also useful, and a lot of those principles are also useful, but because there's so much more text there, you're going to have to spend a little time learning it first before it's really going to pay off benefits.
So to reflect that back at you, it sounds like what you're saying is that the big one with the dynamic aid is that you can manage attention more effectively.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm going to follow on there because the question I have is, it's clear that there's a high correlation between how fast you can find things and how little there is on the page. The less there is, faster. And you're winning on the basis of that. Now, that assumes that the thing you want is always there. So
Yes.
the page which has way too much text on it may have stuff which you didn't manage to get onto the page there. And if you want to actually test the time, then it's a time to go to another page and find it and so on and so on.
Yeah,
Do you have any
absolutely.
way of testing that?
We did a little, so with the eye tracking study, we did a little mini study on how page turning would affect the times. And it turns out that having something that's not on the page, if you have one page versus two, but you can see them at the same time, it doesn't make much of a difference. But as soon as you have to turn that page, it actually does impact the amount of time it takes you to find the answer, because you kind of have to search the whole page before you know it's not there. And then you can look at the next page, or search enough of the page that you can guess that it's not there. So it does make a difference. And so for something like the dynamic aid, this again would play into that. If it's not up on the screen, you can't find it fast. And so one of the things that actually we would like to do is to verify our intuition that they're actually easy to keep up to date and keep the context correct on those dynamic aids. Yeah?
So you made reference to learning times, but I think you were talking about learning to use the aid itself. And the study is all about performance of skills that you already have. This assists. Have you considered these tools as teaching aids for beginners?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is that people are not just going to start picking up these aids if they've never used them before. But if you can get them to use them at med school, if you can get them as a training aid, then as they get to be residents and full doctors, they'll carry that with them. And so one of the ways in long-term changing of practice, you can kind of build a tool for training using your aids or using the narrative simulation, and then allow that as a vehicle for carrying forward the aids into real practice. Yeah?
I have a question related to that. With the 20-point difference in the med school students when they use the aid, is there concern that people, if you were to move aids into like the teaching environment, they might become too accustomed to a particular aid? And so, if they're faced with a new, even dynamic aid, but things are laid out in different content or context that might just negatively affect performance.
Absolutely. So we are in the middle of analyzing some data that we're just running this week and last week that is comparing our new Dynamic++ to the dynamic aid. And kind of it has some mixed results right now. And we think that one of the reasons for that may be that they've seen that dynamic aid in our study 3 or 4 times. All of a sudden we've changed the layout on them. It looks almost the same, but it's not. And that can be, I think, a pretty big issue. We also had our collaborators, they've done some looking into preferences for aids. And it just turns out that people always prefer the aid that they've used before, no matter how good or bad they are. So as soon as you know one of them, you don't want to change. You don't want to have to learn something new. Yeah, Jeff.
So shift gears a little bit. One of the things I thought was interesting from a process and evaluation perspective was your use of narrative simulation. And I thought you did a really nice job of articulating some of the benefits. Certainly it's less costly than some of the more detailed simulations. I was wondering if you had any verification or evidence on maybe negative trade-offs, things that you saw in the more high-fidelity simulations that you were unable to observe in narrative. And then second to that, just wondering if you might generalize what are other areas of HCI where you think narrative simulation might be a useful technique for others to adopt.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question, remind me of that really quickly.
So negative trade-offs.
Yeah, negative trade-offs.
Benefits.
Absolutely.
What are the things that you miss when you go to that level of fidelity?
So one of the things that you miss is the difference between verbalizing knowledge and actually enacting knowledge. So we have some doctors who come in who they just off the top of their head instantly know all the answers. And some doctors who maybe don't instantly off the top of their head, they can't verbalize them, but they're still potentially good doctors. We're not saying that they're bad doctors here, but it's all about, in a narrative simulation, verbalizing the answers to the questions as opposed to actually going and doing it, like drawing up the drugs. So there's some potential trade-offs here about, it's more like school and a little bit less like real life. And second question is, what other domains do we think that we could use for narrative simulation? So a couple of the ones that we've talked about and we spent some time trying to work through was, so things like cooking. Cooking is an interesting one because it seems kind of straightforward, but it's got a lot of the same properties. It's time sensitive. If you make some mistakes over here, then you're going to push off something else. Things get off. You have a bad meal. So being able to actually evaluate aids for cooking might be one place that we can use this. And just other places where you need a lot of expertise. So if you can imagine, I mean, airplane pilots are another example where they need a lot of expertise. You can't just test them anywhere. And so maybe now you can start engaging them in a narrative simulation where they have to show some of that knowledge. And you can also do it much less expensively than a full simulator.
I think scuba diving is an example like that.
Scuba diving.
Lots of things to check.
Yes.
And I think actually my instructor
Safety
did
checks.
that even though they didn't think of it in the same process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here.